Sometimes a single man seems to have been carved out of the sea itself, with hands that could both mend a torn sail and tear an empire apart. In the age of wood and cannon, one commander moved like a ghost beneath the stars, turning fragile ships into instruments of history. This is the story of a captain who made audacity into a tactic, and whose name is still spoken with equal measures of awe and outrage. Thomas Cochrane was a naval officer of the early 19th century, a commander in the Royal Navy, and later an architect of revolutions in South America. He was a hero to some nations, an insubordinate problem to his superiors, and the subject of scandal that haunted his public life. He captured ships that should have crushed him, outwitted blockades that seemed impenetrable, and wrote dispatches that read like orders for an age of risk. There will be moments in this account that seem impossible, pieces of daring that look like theater, and legal twists that read like melodrama. At the center stands a man who said once in private correspondence, "I act with a certainty that fences me to success, and with a stubbornness that makes failure less likely than folly." To understand how a single captain could shape naval doctrine and national destiny, we will begin at his beginnings, follow the routes of his command, watch a pivotal boarding unfold at night, witness the collapse of his reputation in the courts, and then trail him into the wars of liberation in the Southern Hemisphere. The narrator speaks from a vantage forged in archives, letters, and contemporary reports, and will lay out both the feats and the controversies with exacting detail. Before we move on, a brief note on support. This episode is produced with focus and care to let you follow complex strategy without loss of drama. If you value clear audio and a steady rhythm in long narratives, consider using quality headphones. They make the difference between hearing a line and feeling its weight. In what follows, we will see his origins, the making of a commander, the first captures, his rise and tactical innovations, the central battle that defined him, his fall from official grace, a rebirth in foreign waters, the moral and political entanglements of empire, and finally, an epilogue that measures his true legacy. This is a story told through letters, court records, and eyewitness logs, and narrated to capture the smell of tar, the grit of powder, and the particular tremor of a bell summoned at midnight. Thomas Cochrane was born into a family of modest status, with a bloodline that kept one eye on honor and the other on survival. His childhood estate sat beside a rocky inlet where gulls wheeled and the wind learned the language of timbers. The family home was neither manor nor ruin. It was a place of strict dinners and longer silences, where conversations about duty alternated with arguments over accounts. Early letters describe a boy impatient with small talk and consumed by maps. He learned to draw coastlines before he learned to box. His mother taught him precision in measurement. His father taught him to keep his temper when insulted. A neighbor mariner named Angus McCrae took the boy on short trips along the local coast and told him of tides that turned like a clock and captains who read the weather as if it were scripture. In adolescence, Thomas found a copy of a small treatise on rigging and devoured it by candlelight until the pages smeared. He could taste the salt before he felt it, and would later say to a friend that the sea was less a place than a set of problems to be solved. Those early lessons mattered. He learned to measure the angle of a mast against a star to estimate latitude, to listen to a hull for signs of wear, and to read men as one reads sails. The desire to command was not born from vanity, but from an itch for responsibility, and a conviction that a nimble ship in skilled hands could do what larger fleets could not. That conviction would later bring triumph and disgrace in equal measure. The first formal step into a naval career began with an apprenticeship on a modest cutter where he served as a midshipman. Training was relentless. He rose before dawn to tend to hammocks and then spent afternoons learning seamanship under a watchful lieutenant named William Hardy. Hardy corrected his knotwork, his chart reading, and his tendency to cut corners when under pressure. In a wet harbor, Thomas once refused to obey an order that he believed would strand the cutter on a mudbank. He argued with a quiet intensity until the officer in command relented and withdrew a sail. That episode earned him a reputation as a man who would bend a chain of command if he believed the chain was leading a ship to ruin. As the Napoleonic Wars intensified, he was posted to increasingly larger vessels, and in each new assignment he watched how captains dealt with fear, with cowardice, and with glory. The first time he commanded a small sloop, he found that discipline was not the same as respect. He learned quickly that to secure obedience, he needed the loyalty of the contramaster and the confidence of the crew. He listened to the contramaster Samuel Reed, who could smell trouble before it arrived, and made him an early advisor. Reed recommended swapping the heavy blanket in the forecastle for lighter canvas to keep the men from succumbing to damp disease. The trick paid off. The crew remained healthier and more alert. The captain kept notes, a habit that turned into meticulous logs. Those logs record the first capture that would mark him as audacious. A merchantman twice the size of his sloop appeared at dawn, its colors a mixture of false flags. Thomas devised a ruse. He sketched on a scrap of paper used as a folding map. With the wind in their favor, he ordered lights to be doused, sails to be shimmied, and oars to be rowed silently. The boarding unfolded like a theatrical scene, the creak of ropes, the smell of lamp oil, the whisper of boots on wet planks. Dialogue at that moment was compact, precise, and full of intent. Captain Thomas said softly to his helmsman, "Where do you believe the enemy will go?" The helmsman replied, "The channel favors the wind to starboard, the customs cutter hides there." Another voice, Samuel Reed, whispered, "If we pass the inlet, they will think we flee." Thomas answered, "We will not flee. We will pretend and then pounce." A lookout called from the mast, "I see their colors. They lower a flag." An officer on the merchant shouted, "Who are you? Identify yourselves." Thomas shouted back, quietly, "We are traders with news of a storm." The merchant captain laughed, "Are you daft? No storm is near." Thomas said, "Keep him talking, draw him close." Someone on Thomas' crew, John McClellan, cracked a grin and added, "We have a letter for you, good sir." The merchant captain stepped to the rail and exposed his hull. He will not sell his cargo cheap. Thomas leaned forward and spoke in measured tone. "Then sell it as you wish while we count our coins." The final exchange was brief. A plank clanged, a man shouted, "Away with him!" and suddenly the cutter leaped aboard. The sound of tackles, the smell of tar, and the taste of copper in the air created a sensory landscape that embedded the event in the crew memory. The boarding was messy and close, hands gripping ropes, faces wet with sweat and rain, gunpowder in the creases of sleeves. They took the merchant with minimal bloodshed and a cargo that was worth the risk. That seizure made his name and created the first of many claims that he preferred cunning to sheer force. As his reputation grew, he moved into command of larger ships and more daring missions. He learned to use the night as an ally and to treat the concept of the blockade as a puzzle to be solved, not an immovable wall. He developed a suite of tactics that confused many of his opponents and thrilled his men. Sailing under false colors became a practiced art, and his crews were trained to change flags and accents with theatrical speed. He executed night approaches so silent that even gulls seemed hushed, and he used coastal lights as markers to triangulate positions when charts were incomplete. The technical process of preparing a false flag approach required choreography and timing. The men packed sails with oils to keep them supple, and slowed rigging with cloth to avoid squeaks. The signalmen practiced hoisting and lowering flags in the dark until the movement was reflexive. At sea, a single mistake in timing could expose an entire use. The process took days of practice, and the contramaster Samuel Reed would rehearse it like a drill in a theater company. Another technical explanation concerned the use of sweeps when wind died. A ship might be too large to row, but with a system of davits and portable sweeps, a commander could propel a frigate by human labor across a calm stretch, buying perhaps an hour of movement that could convert defeat into opportunity. Required men with endurance and a leader who could order minute adjustments to the yards. These procedures were not glamorous, but they were decisive. The ascent brought names that will return throughout this telling.
Admiral Sir John Jervis watched him with a mixture of irritation and grudging respect. Lord Robert Dundas in the Admiralty took note of prizes and of the disruption of commerce. Captain William Parker exchanged courteous letters and then harsher ones when prizes were contested. Samuel Reed remained loyal on deck while John McClellan and Peter O'Connor each provided sharp counsel in moments of doubt. Later, Allied figures would appear, Bernardo O'Higgins and Manuel Blanco Encalada, who recruited him into campaigns across the Atlantic. Each of these figures impacted events concretely. Reed by saving a ship from boarding, McClellan by securing vital intelligence, Parker by challenging a prize court, and O'Higgins by offering an army port. Over time, Thomas built a web of colleagues, rivals, and enemies, and each name would tie into decisions that mattered. The narrative arrives at a climax that naval historians often revisit, a night assault executed with a precision that looked like choreography. The scene took place off a heavily defended port where a fleet lay at anchor behind a chain of smaller gunboats and shore batteries. The objective was a large convoy protected by a blockade. The preparation was meticulous. Men checked priming pans, the contramaster inspected the tackle, and the cook's crew handed out small rations to keep strength steady. The night was thick with fog, a damp press of cold that made breath short and hands numb. On the eve of the attack, Thomas gathered his senior officers in the dim aft cabin and spoke plainly. Thomas said, "We will move as if we are nothing more than shadows." Reed replied, "Shadows can be sharp as blades if they are directed." McClellan said, "If the batteries find us, they will tear our hull to splinters." Peter answered, "Then we will be gone before they aim truly." A young lieutenant, Edward March, asked, "And the convoy, if they escape?" Thomas looked at him and said, "Then we will haunt their wake." Another officer struggled. "Sounds of oars on the water will betray us. How do you keep quiet?" Thomas gave a small smile. "We keep the men warm and breathing, we oil the ropes, and we move like a whisper." A sailor called out, "Master Captain, the wind shifted. We will not reach them." Thomas answered, "Then we burn the signal, and
use the darkness as a cloak." Reed placed a hand on the table. "There is no honor in deceit. Some will call this trickery." Thomas fixed Reed. "We are at war, and the sea is indifferent to honor. It rewards results." A final exchange was curt. The boats slipped from their davits, and men felt the freeze of wet air as they rowed. The attack unfolded with bursts of noise and stretches of silent rowing. The slap of oars on water, the metallic smell of shot, and the sting of splinters. Sensory details multiply in such a scene. The taste of gunpowder in the mouth, the rasp of rope against calloused palms, the sudden heat when a swivel gun found a crew, and the distant thump of an anchor chain settling. In rapid minutes, the enemy convoy was boarded, cargoes seized, and a prize crew set to steer captured merchants out of danger. The fog swallowed much of the spectacle, and that ambiguity helped protect the attackers as they melted back into the night. The outcome was spectacular, but left behind questions about the ethics of subterfuge and the fragile line between daring and lawlessness. Not every triumph was purely tactical. With success came politics, and the first major political collision arrived in the courts. Prize money and credits were the lifeblood of seafaring officers, and disputes about who had claim to captured goods often traveled to admiralty courts. On one contested prize, a senior officer alleged that Thomas had used prohibited signals to secure a capture. The accusation escalated into a public hearing where the stakes were as reputational as legal. The courtroom smelled of candle wax and old leather, and the rhythm of testimony sounded like a sea shanty transcribed into legalese. Witnesses included former allies who had grown suspicious, and a clerk who calculated prize shares with ruthless precision. The exchanges were sharp and sometimes petty. A court witness, Captain Parker, said, "He used a flag that was not his to approach the merchant." Thomas answered, "If the flag was false, it was false for both of us at sea." Parker replied, "We followed the rules. We did not disguise ourselves."
Another lawyer insisted, "The weight of the law must fall evenly across the deck." A clerk stated, "The accounts are irregular and I will not ignore them." Thomas spoke quietly, "I have logs and I have letters that explain our actions." A juror asked, "Were lives in danger?" An officer answered, "They were in danger until he stepped in." The prosecutors claimed, "Deception cannot be rewarded by the Crown." Thomas countered, "The Crown rewards service that protects commerce and harms the enemy." A final plea was made by his defense, "I ask you to remember context, to remember war." The verdict that followed would begin to unravel his official standing. Accused of misconduct and implicated in a scandal involving financial impropriety, Thomas faced suspension and later a harsh sentence in a public trial that some saw as politically motivated. He was expelled from official service and his titles were questioned in papers that loved scandal. The fall was rapid and the emotional cost immense. He lost command of ships that his men loved and suffered the public humiliation of being placed in the dock. The moment of disgrace introduced new tension of a different sort, legal tension, not simply of cannon and rope, but of reputational survival. These moments of tension each deserve concentrated attention and description. Moment of tension 1. Night before the trial, he sat in a small cell and listened to the drip of water, the scrape of rats, and the voices of distant prisoners. His hands held a letter he had written to his wife, the ink blurred from his tears. He felt rage and a peculiar clarity, the kind that a man feels before choosing what part of himself to save. The cell walls smelled of stale bread and tobacco, and that smell stuck in the back of his throat. He wondered whether to fight in court or flee abroad, and both options tasted of risk. Moment of tension 2. At sea, during a later engagement, a shot tore through the mainmast. He heard the timber snap like bone, and the shock of the impact rolled through the deck. Men cried out, ropes fell, and a young powder monkey was thrown against a barrel. Thomas moved through the smoke, counting voices, calling names, issuing orders, and the noise of musket fire mixed with the distant boom of a shore battery. For a moment he stood exposed, and a splinter cut his cheek. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he ignored it and kept issuing commands. The ship shuddered under him, but did not sink, and in that fragile victory he tasted both survival and the cost of leading. Moment of tension 3. In a foreign port months later, he stood in a smoky council room where generals argued over payment of sailors and disposition of prizes. Voices raised and fists slammed. Maps were pushed aside, and one general accused him of hoarding booty. The room stank of sweat, gun oil, and the last embers of a dying candle. Thomas felt the weight of years like a sash across his shoulders. He realized that to maintain the campaign, he would have to accept compromises, and to refuse would be to doom men who had followed him across continents. After the fall, at home, exile and accusation became the doors that led to his reinvention. He accepted invitations to serve foreign governments, joining forces with revolutionary leaders in Chile and later Brazil. His knowledge of blockade bypassing, night approaches, and quick boarding translated into liberation tactics on another continent. He recruited a multinational crew that included the contramaster Samuel Reed, now older and steadier, a local guerrilla leader named Esteban who knew the coastal creeks intimately, a young pilot called Miguel Santos who could read the shoals, and several British volunteers who had followed him out of loyalty. Among the secondary characters who influenced his new campaigns were Bernardo O'Higgins, who granted ports and troops, Manuel Blanco Encalada, who negotiated political support, Commodore Sir Sidney Smith, who sent letters of warning, and José Bonifacio, who exchanged strategic counsel. Each made concrete contributions. O'Higgins provided safe harbors. Encalada negotiated supply lines. Smith warned of diplomatic backlash, and Bonifacio introduced him to Brazilian supporters. Their combined efforts produced daring raids on royalist convoys and actions that reshaped supply lines for armies inland. The theater of war shifted from blockade to nation-building, and the stakes magnified from prize money to the birth of republics. Campaigns in the South demanded different logistics and a different kind of diplomacy. He oversaw recruitment of sailors from coastal towns and explained to local leaders the need to standardize rations and to provide reliable maps. He improved fort defenses by training garrison men in volley fire and taught navies how to use shallow draft vessels to attack larger ships in confined bays. A technical description of landing party coordination describes the process of selecting men by skill, setting watch rotations, and designing improvised ladders to take fortifications quietly. The technique required timing that matched tides and moon phases, a keen understanding of local currents, and an ability to signal between ship and shore without alerting the enemy. He instituted weekly drills that simulated various failures and built redundancy into every plan. The result was a sequence of victories that recast him as a liberator in the eyes of many. Yet success in the new theaters created friction with local authorities who expected payment for naval services and who feared the redistribution of booty. Arguments over who should keep captured goods erupted into heated disputes. On one occasion, a shoreline village demanded compensation for damaged warehouses, and a provincial governor insisted that half the prize fleet be turned over to the treasury. Thomas insisted on contractual terms that protected his crews and secured long-term loyalty. The conflict over payments introduced fissures among his allies and sowed resentment among the very men who had fought beside him. He navigated these political shoals by forging personal relationships with local leaders, and by sometimes making pragmatic concessions that left him morally compromised at times. Internal conflicts took further shape when rivals sought to undermine his command with accusations that he favored foreign volunteers over local sailors. Tensions flared in council meetings where generals argued over strategy and men broke into fistfights in berthing houses. He calmed storms by naming trusted officers to key positions, and by formalizing prize courts that adjudicated claims in writing. That move reduced some disputes, but also institutionalized a bureaucracy that later fueled new resentments. The politics of war in foreign lands required constant negotiation with personalities as much with fortresses. As the campaigns matured, Thomas achieved a measure of redemption. He led blockades that supported ground offensives and coordinated attacks that apprehended supply lines crucial to royalist forces. He won iconic battles that became material for national myth. At the same time, his personal life began to fray. Letters returned unanswered and debts mounted. He wrote to an old friend, Samuel Reed, "I have not forgotten the sea, and she has not forgotten me." And that line captures the mixture of loyalty and loneliness that tracked him. In victory, he gained titles, and in other moments, he found himself back in the crosshairs of diplomats who resented his independence. The later part of his career was dominated by the uneasy balance between conquest and governance. As republics formed, they needed institutions, not only victories. He advised ministers on naval organization, drafted manuals for coastal defense, and supervised the building of small yards that could repair hulls with local timber. The technical process of establishing a naval academy included curriculum for navigation, seamanship, gunnery, and codes of conduct. Those manuals were written in plain language so that literate volunteers and autodidacts could absorb them. This emphasis on training had long-term effects, decentralizing expertise and seeding local navies with competent officers. The training also meant that his legacy would be institutional rather than personal. Internal rivalries and external diplomacy combined to shape his final returns to public life. Reports from London filtered in, and old enemies renewed their attacks. Yet, the republics where he served erected monuments, named frigates after his victories, and placed him in ceremonial posts. He oscillated between the roles of advisor, commander, and occasional critic of the very regimes he helped to found. The contradictions were evident, and they made his life the study in paradox that we began with. In the final act, his career wound toward quieter days, punctuated by formal recognitions and private regrets. He returned briefly to Britain to petition for reinstatement and to clear his name. The petitions were long legal documents that described captures and counted prize money and also laid bare political tensions. He stood before boards in rooms smelling of polished wood and tobacco and argued that his service had been in the public interest. The tone of his defense was both legal and moral. He insisted that results mattered more than the ceremonial niceties of rank. The petition succeeded partially, and he received honors late in life, but not without the residue of public doubt. He continued to write and to advise, even as age crept in, and hands that once climbed shrouds trembled slightly when holding a quill. The epilogue of his final years is best told in 3 moments, each measured by time and consequence. 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after a decisive campaign that secured a coastal region for an emerging republic. 1 month later, the port was bustling with activity. Sailors unloaded supplies while local merchants counted ledgers. He stood on the quay with Bernardo O'Higgins and watched the tide of people come and go. He felt the satisfaction of immediate results, the smell of salt and fresh timber bright in his nose. He wrote letters to friends describing the scene, praising the punctuality of his crews, and noting the small triumphs that make a campaign worth the cost. The population celebrated with improvised fireworks, and the smell of grilled fish filled the air. The 1 month marker was about relief, survival, and a short taste of communal joy. 3 months on, the administrative consequences began to assert themselves. The Treasury demanded accounting, and the Provincial Council asked for a formal Navy list. Men who had fought together now argued about shares, and the first petitions for promotion were submitted. He spent nights drafting regulations and mornings training officers in seamanship. The workload was bureaucratic and exacting, and the noise of celebration gave way to the mechanical rhythm of governance. He negotiated a treaty with a neighboring province, and the reward was a fragile stability that required constant tending. The 3-month moment measured consolidation and the slow transformation of victory into institution. 6 months after the victory, the true test of legacy emerged. Schools of seamanship opened, and young cadets learned the vocabulary of sails. A small frigate bore a carved name in his honor, and children on the docks pointed as she passed. He sat with local leaders and debated fiscal policy for naval maintenance, and observed with a weary satisfaction that his tactical lessons had become curriculum. Yet he also recognized a sting of compromise that would never fully disappear. Old court records were reprinted in foreign papers, and critics claimed that his methods sired lawlessness. The 6-month moment was about memory and interpretation. Some would remember the daring, some would note the scandal, and both would be right. His final months thus combined institutional seed sowing with unresolved debates that would follow his name for decades. In closing, we can place his life under 2 headers: the man who rewrote tactics and the man who collided with politics. He was a commander who made the sea a laboratory, a place where improvisation and audacity could turn the tide of wars. He taught men to use the night to advantage, to move small ships with human power, and to make quick boarding a decisive instrument. He institutionalized training and left behind manuals and systems that endured. At the same time, his career was marked by fights with authority, legal persecutions, and moral ambiguity. He wore the praise of grateful republics, but also bore the jeers of those who saw him as a troublemaker. His legacy is mixed for a reason. History rarely presents simple heroes. He reshaped naval practice, inspired nations, and provoked the legal machinery of his own country to rebuke him. That contradiction captures the man in full. If this account left you curious about the choice you would have made at his elbow, consider sharing your view. If you found yourself surprised by a moment of courage or unsettled by an ethical question, start your comment with, "I would have," and explain briefly which decision you would have made and why. Your perspective helps others weigh the same dilemmas and fuels our community discussion. Well-reasoned comments inform future episodes and often introduce angles we might have missed in the archives. Now that we have followed his ascent and seen the first costs of command, we will move to the next phase,
his legal battles, and the way exile led to reinvention across an ocean. He will be remembered in monuments in regional harbors with ships bearing his name, and in the curricula of naval academies that still teach maneuvering in confined waters. Scholars cite his logs and letters in articles that examine how small ship tactics upset conventional fleet doctrines. Naval officers study his boarding techniques and his use of deception as legitimate and effective tools when used against hostile forces. At the same time, his life prompted legal reforms about prize distribution and naval discipline, because the controversies his actions generated exposed weaknesses in command oversight. Monuments sometimes simplify his image into a symbol of boldness and forget the full texture of his choices. But historians have recovered letters and memos that demonstrate a consistent commitment to results and to the men under his command. His writings later in life show an awareness of consequences and a desire to build durable institutions rather than depending on personal charisma alone. His story teaches us that war and innovation are intimate with one another, and that those who innovate often pay costs that are social and legal as well as military. He combined the instincts of a tactician, a practical engineer, and a political actor. He was autodidactic in many respects, learning navigation and gunnery through practice and reading, and by teaching himself languages when necessary. He could fix a broken block in the dark and later draft a protocol for a naval academy in clear prose. His life stands as a study in the tensions between individual initiative and institutional norms. If you found value in this account, consider subscribing to ensure you get forthcoming episodes that track the lives of other naval innovators and political operatives. If you want to dive deeper, links to primary sources and translations of his logbook are in the description. Discuss in the comments, "I would have," and explain which decision you would have made. The sea makes heroes out of those who understand it and villains out of those who defy convention. In the end, Thomas Cochrane remained a man who trusted his judgment and asked the world to judge his results. He was at once condemned and celebrated, expelled and exalted, flawed and brilliant, and that is perhaps the truest summary of a life spent on the rope lines between nations and the relentless sea.